I'm Charlie Donlea, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Charlie Donlea.
Be sure to go over to hankgarner.com and subscribe to the show. There's handy links in the sidebar where you can subscribe on your favorite podcast app, on your phone, on your computer, wherever you do it. You can find links there. You also find us on YouTube. There's a link in the sidebar as well. I'd like to thank some sponsors who faithfully support the show and allow us to do what we do. George Kramer and his new book, Blind to Blood. Ben Bergstall had a unique job. He was a tissue procurement specialist. When someone died, he would surgically remove people's body parts for donation. He really enjoyed doing it. So much so, when an anonymous email asked him to consider recovering people's body parts on the side, he was more than happy to oblige. The trouble was Ben sought out live people to fulfill his clandestine clients' needs. Read all about Ben's exploits in this riveting book that delves into tissue procurement, Blind to Blood by George Kramer. Pick up your copy today on Amazon and find out why people are saying this is an intense page-turner, that they are also fascinated by digging into the mind of Ben and finding out how he works. If you would like to see a look into the darker side of humanity, pick up Blind to Blood, the riveting new page-turner by George Kramer. Also, I'd like to thank Richard Thomas for sponsoring the show. Richard has an online fiction writers course, the University of Richard, and there's a link in the show notes. There's a banner there where you can click on and you can see the course guide. Lots and lots of classes coming up. He can help teach you to be the best writer you can be. There's classes coming up for the 2018 and 2019 season, like short story mechanics, writing flash fiction, contemporary dark fiction, advanced creative writing workshops, how to write a novel in a year, lots and lots of stuff from a very prolific and excellent writer, Richard Thomas, teaching you how to be the best writer you can be. It's the University of Richard. There's a link in the show notes. As always, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from our good friend Richard Gleaves. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Guys, today I have a guest on the show. Charlie Donlea is his name. He's got a brand new book out. It's been out for, when you're hearing this, for about 2 weeks now. It's called Don't Believe It, and this is one thrill ride of a book. I highly recommend it. I've had a copy for a few days now and have been reading through it, and from page one, it just grabs you and does not let go. Welcome to the show, Charlie.
Hank, good to talk with you. Great introduction. I like that you can't put the book down.
I'm literally holding it in my left hand. I literally can't put it down. I've tried, and it just keeps jumping back. We begin.
I love it. I love
it. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is: what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, good question. Mine was junior. Mine's easy. I was a junior in college. I had never read a book before in my life. I had never read a novel for pleasure. I had never read an assigned novel. I somehow made it through my entire academic career without reading a book. I made it through with Cliff's Notes. But for some reason, I was a 20-year-old kid, and I picked up John Grisham's book, The Firm. I still remember I was in my dorm room, and I picked it up and immediately got hooked on the suspense and went through all of those feelings. I couldn't put it down. I didn't want it to end. I couldn't wait to get back to it. I kept thinking about it. And somehow, nonsensically, when I finished that book, I had no creative writing experience. I had no aspirations to write ever prior to that. But somehow, nonsensically, I put that book down and decided I was going to write a book someday. And that was, so John Grisham did it for me.
That is amazing. I love that story so much. You know, it's one of my pet theories, and I know people get sick of hearing it, but I believe that storytellers are born that way. I think there's a gene or whatever. That's, you know, a simple way to explain it, but you know, whatever. There's something inside us that needs to tell stories. Some people realize that when they're 3 years old, when they're making, you know, books at the kitchen table. Some people, it's, you know, when they have a high school English teacher that gives them something to read and ignites it. And then, you know, there are folks that, you know, find a John Grisham book and get, you know, their fire lit by that. As a Mississippi native, I love that it was John Grisham that did that, you know, another native Mississippi son. So that's fantastic. What were you studying in college at the time?
But I was a biology major.
Well, that makes perfect sense.
Of course, that's all biology majors go on to become authors, novelists. But see, I hated writing. I hated writing and reading.
Yeah.
To the degree when I was a kid, that's naturally I went towards the sciences, because just as I was growing up, I just didn't do well with reading. I don't know if it was a comprehension problem or what it was, but it was never something that interested me. And so, yeah, I just followed the sciences, became a biology major, and, took my life in that direction until, even years after college. It took me that many years before I sat down to actually try to write my first book.
When you had that revelation, you finished the firm, it's that really satisfying ending. You're probably sitting there smiling at the end, that he figured out a way to stick it to everybody and walk away scot-free. What was that inclination in your mind when you said, I'm going to write a book one day? Were you thinking a suspense thriller like The Firm? Did you have any idea what you would go on to do one day?
Oh, yeah. So after I read The Firm, not that John Grisham needs you and me to promote his books, but not only,
right.
He sticks it to everybody, and then his wife asks him if he's ever made love on the beach, and he comes up with an answer, no, even though, part of his issue was the whole firm changed who he was. It was such a great ending. Yeah, when I finished that book, I was going to write thrillers. I mean, I knew I was going to write thrillers. I went on and I read from John Grisham. I read Robert Ludlum and Tom Clancy and Nelson DeMille and all of these authors, write thrillers with big, strong male leads, and
right.
That's what I was going to do. Obviously, that's not what I ended up publishing, because all my books have strong female leads, no nonsense female protagonists. But when I first sat down to write my thriller, I wrote it with this big male character, completely with John Grisham's books in mind. That manuscript was a total failure. I had over 100 agents reject it. But what it did for me was it taught me, it sort of proved to me that I could write a book. I could finish
right.
a manuscript, which I think is half the battle for most aspiring writers, is they sit with a half-finished manuscript or multiple half-finished manuscripts that they just never managed to get to the end of. So even though that first manuscript was terrible, and I actually had an agent call me to tell me that it was really, really bad, I'll never forget the phone call. He said, well, I wanted to tell you, and I got his name because one of my friends was nice enough to give me, like a friend of a friend gave me a referral to this agent. But he said, I did read your manuscript, and I have to tell you, there's a problem with the suspense. And I said, what's the problem? He said, there isn't any. And I remember, and he said a lot of other terrible things. But when he got off the phone, he said, you know how to write, but you don't know how to write thrillers. So he said, go figure that out before you waste any more of your time. So at that point, I stopped reading all the thrillers as a fan, and I started reading as a student to try to figure out how you create characters and character development, how you create suspense, and how you create plotting and pacing. And so it was a big metamorphosis from, reading the firm and having this grand idea that I was going to write a huge thriller, to kind of figuring it out more analytically. And again, maybe my biology background helped me with that, because you have to be a little bit of a scientist to go and analyze the thriller to figure out how to do it.
And that is a key point. Reading not as a fan but as a student, there really is something to that. To be a writer, you need to do two things. You need to read a lot, and you need to write, and you need to practice that. But I think it goes deeper than read a lot. I think you need to do like you did and approach it analytically to figure out. And when you really love a book, step back from it and find out why you love this book, and then try to even go one step further. And try to approach it critically and say, if I was doing this, would I have made that choice? Is there something I could tweak about this book? And I think when you reach that level, then you're on to something.
Yeah, what a great point. Read it and try to figure out why you're so hooked on it. Well,
right.
I mean, that's great advice.
Yeah. Talking about the rejections and having that novel that failed, I'm like you. I don't think that novel was a failure. It didn't get published, but it taught you an awful lot. And I think everybody needs that one or two desk drawer novels that will never see the light of day, but that show you that you can get to the end of it. If you take a room with 100 people, I guarantee you could poll that room, and 90 of those 100 will tell you that they think they have a book in them. And of that 100 people, maybe one will ever sit down to attempt to write the book, much less finish it. So when you have a finished book, as bad as it may be, you have beat the odds already. Yeah,
for sure. And like you said, even though and by the way, it takes, after you write the book, then you go through like a year of rejection. I mean, at least I did. I went through like a year or two where I was too dense to give up on the manuscript, because I still thought it was great, and despite 100 rejections, I thought on the 101 agent they would come and find me. But yeah, I'm sure that most people feel like they have a book in them, and I bet most people do. Yeah. But getting it out is what's the difficult task.
Brad Meltzer told me this really funny story that, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but the story remains regardless of the numbers. He said that his first book, he sent it to something like 12 agents, and he got 14 rejections. Like one person hated it so much that they wrote multiple rejection letters just to make sure he knew that they hated it.
Love that story.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Look at Mr. Meltzer now.
Yeah. He's barely scraping by, but I think he's going to make it one day.
We'll be okay.
Yeah. So you talked about that love of Grisham and Clancy and these gigantic male heroes, and that then you said that you kind of did the opposite of that, but you write these strong females, but that thread of suspense and tension remains. So just because your protagonist went a little different direction than you thought, I can definitely see the influences of those authors that you looked up to in your work.
Oh, thank you. That's actually a great compliment. Well, much appreciated.
Yeah. So did you work as a chemist or as in the biology field? What did you do after college?
Well, I'm still working as a doctor. I belong to a private ophthalmology practice, and so I'm balancing. Although I have a little more freedom in my schedule, I'm still balancing writing a book a year with practicing medicine in private practice.
which is what a lot of authors that work full time at it do. So, you're maintaining the schedule and running a private practice. That's pretty amazing.
I feel busier than I have ever before. But people always ask where do you find time to do the writing, and the writing, I think if you talk to any author, any novelist, you're not writing for 8 or 10 hours a day.
Right.
You and I were talking before the show. We're both on a deadline right now, so I was anxious to talk to you because I haven't talked to anybody today because you and I have been sitting in front of our computers by ourselves all day.
Right.
But that's only under deadline. When you're not under deadline, if you're pacing yourself correctly, I mean, a novel a year, you can get your stuff done in a reasonable amount of time each day without sitting in front of the computer for 6 or 8 hours. And so a lot of balancing of the career just comes from discipline and daily writing or at least plotting, because I know people ask me all the time, if you write every day, how many words do you write and how many pages? And then they try to extrapolate that by 365 days, and they think you've got like a 3,000 page book. But a lot of it's just plotting and outlining, and then when you go to write, you sit down and you write, and you don't let anything distract you.
Well, 2 pages a day, 500 words will get you a novel a year. It's if you want to break down to the simple math like that, and that's not the reality for most folks. You get an idea, you write 1,500 words one day, maybe you get 2,000 the next day, maybe you go 3 or 4 days and don't write anything, but you come back and you get 500 here, 500 there, and that's the reality of most writers' lives.
For sure it is, yeah. I think for me anyways, my goal is, although I'm behind now, but my goal is, from Labor Day to Memorial Day is when I want to do all my writing, and get it all done, and then work on the edits after that and work on the outline for the next novel, in the 6 months in between those. But yeah, I wish, you could write 2,000 words every day. You'd have a book done in 2 months.
Right.
But that's not realistic, and most writers realize that. And like you said, you have a little bit of sporadic writing, but every day, if you're working on the story, it's going to be finished by the deadline.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Charlie, what was the thing that brought you back around to writing? You said that you kind of shelved that desire for a little while you read more and got into these other authors, and of course started your practice and all the things that life throws at you. When did it come back around and you say, okay, I think it's time to write that novel now?
So I wrote the first manuscript all on my own, and nobody knew I was writing a book besides my wife, and she never read it till the very end. And I went through all the rejection for a couple of years, and had that agent give me a call and tell me these terrible things about the book. But I was still encouraged after he got off the phone with me, because he told me I had some writing ability. I just needed to maybe figure out how to write thrillers or even change genres. So I ended up sitting down right after that and writing another manuscript that took about 1.5 years to write. But I had found with that manuscript, I landed an agent. So I did all my queries, and I found an agent who represented me for my second full-length manuscript. So she and I sent this manuscript out to New York, and we just got rejection after rejection, and that took about 1 year before she decided we couldn't do anything more with that manuscript. And she told me to write another one, which I did, and went through the same process of about 1.5 years or 2 years of writing a manuscript to give it to my agent, to send it off to editors in New York, and went through the same process of about 1 year's worth of rejections. And so it was at that point, after my third failed manuscript, that I took a break from writing because, I was very discouraged, and I didn't think I had any more ideas. I was very unmotivated at that point. But the greatest thing that happened when I stopped writing, because I stopped writing for maybe about 6 months, and I never told my agent I stopped writing. She would send emails every once in a while, are you working on something? And I would, lie to her in some degree to say, yeah, I'm coming up with something. It'll be there. But I had really come to terms with the fact that it was just too hard to break into the industry. But, after a few months of not writing, what I realized was, I wasn't chasing my dream anymore. And when you're not chasing your dream, a lot of other things in your life don't feel right. And so I came up with the decision that even if I never, had my book on a bookstore shelf, I just couldn't stop the pursuit of the dream, the pursuit of trying to write a book that would someday be published. So I sat down, a couple months, 6 months after that last rejection, and came up with a story about a girl who was murdered in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and that book ended up being called Summit Lake, and that ended up turning into my first novel, my first published novel.
Now, the inspiration for Summit Lake, was this inspired by some family trips that you take up into the wilds of Canada?
Yeah, so my dad and I fish every year in Canada. So we'd go way up into Manitoba and way up into Ontario, and the setting is beautiful up there. And part of it, minus the mountains, reminded me a lot of Lake Tahoe, where my family and I had been a few times. So I took kind of the combination of those two settings of like the God's country, northern
right.
Canada, and the mountains of Lake Tahoe. And we just came up with this fictional town called Summit Lake. We put it in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and off I went.
So what was when did you know that you were on to something with that idea? You kind of scratched around for ideas for a while, and I guess lacked that confidence that then turns into motivation. But there was something about this idea. What was it that turned it on for you?
So it was the whole process of, chasing my dream and feeling like I had to give it one more shot. And when I sat down to write this third manuscript, I kind of asked myself why I was trying to write. What I was hoping to achieve. And was it just that I wanted to see the book on the bookshelf? Was it just that, you want to see your name on the cover of the jacket? Or what was the purpose behind sitting down and trying to do this again? And I wanted to get that straight before I just sat down at the computer, because remember, no one's paying, you don't get paid to write a book. You get paid when the book sells.
Right.
So I hadn't made $1 from writing the book. I had a lot of these 3 manuscripts. I had a lot of rejection, a lot of heartbreak. Your confidence level when you go through that is really low. And so I was trying to ask myself, before I embarked on this another year-long journey of writing a manuscript that may never see the light of day, what my purpose was. And I got back, to John Grisham's book. I remember reading his book and slowing down at the end. And, I had like 50 pages left, and I was slowing down because I didn't want to finish the book.
You want to savor that last.
I liked it so much.
You want to savor that last act.
Amen. Yeah. And so I decided what I wanted to try to do was write a book that did for the reader, for any reader, what John Grisham's book had done for me years and years ago. And so with that motivation in mind, I sat down and I wrote this story about a girl who was murdered in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the investigative reporter that goes and looks into her case and all the secrets that gets uncovered in the process. And once we did that, we had 3 editors interested in the book. And I think a lot of the change between the previous 3 manuscripts and Summit Lake was that my point of view of writing it what I was hoping to achieve was much more palpable in that book than it was in any of the three, failed manuscripts prior to that. And I still get a kick out of it. Whenever a reader tells me through email or when I see them at a signing that they didn't want the book to end, I get the biggest kick out of it, because I know that I've done for that individual reader what I was hoping to achieve, because that's what John Grisham's book had done for me.
Yeah, there is no bigger compliment than that. And I told an author that one time, and I forget how I said it, but it was something like, I stretched this book out over 2 weeks or something like that. And they said, oh, well, I hope that someone will just tear through it in 48 hours and just can't get enough. And I said, no, you don't understand. It's not that it was drudgery to read. It's that I wanted to savor every page, and that there's not a better compliment than that, But I was going to ask you, and you kind of answered it there. But I was going to ask you what you felt changed in your writing between the failed manuscripts and Summit Lake, because obviously the more we write and the more life experience we get, and the more we practice the craft, you get better. You can't help but to get better. Anything that you do, you just naturally get better at. But by the same token, you kind of either have it or you don't. The mechanics get better, but if you can tell a story is either there or not. You can tweak the process, but something happened between those first three and when you broke out. So you attribute it to just desire and the reconnecting with the dream that you had, and that being your motivation. That's what you attribute it to.
Absolutely. Just, like I said, I had this blind ambition of writing a book after I got done with college, and that's what I used. I sat down, I wrote this terrible 650-page manuscript that nobody, if I look back on it now, that there's no way any publishing house would ever buy it. But it was blind ambition that I wanted to do. I wanted to have my name on a book like John Grisham and Nelson DeMille and Robert Ludlum and Tom Clancy. That was my goal. And if your goal is just to get your name on a book, likely you're not going to the story that you're hoping to tell isn't going to translate into something that's really meaningful. When my goal changed from I want to write a book to I want to entertain a reader, the way that I wrote the story changed, the characters changed, the setting, the plot, the pacing, all of that came together. And I had never been more excited to write a book. I got about a quarter of the way through writing Summit Lake, and I just couldn't wait to finish it, because I saw where it was going. A lot of it changed, throughout all the edits, but I knew what I wanted to achieve. And I think with the other books, maybe that knowledge wasn't there when I sat down each day to write those manuscripts.
Yeah. It only stands to reason that if you're a person who can make up whole worlds and whole characters and people out of thin air, those would be the kind of people that could will success into being. If a writer can't turn that desire into something, then nobody can. So you got the Summit Lake was published, and you followed that up with The Girl Who Was Taken. What's the story behind that book?
Girl Who Was Taken is the story of two high school seniors that go missing from a small North Carolina town. And 2 weeks later, when the town is sort of has lost all hope that these girls will show up, one of them miraculously reappears, and she had been held in this bunker in the woods, and she reappears miraculously. And a year later, she ends up writing a memoir about her time in captivity, all about her abduction. Meanwhile, the other girl who was taken is never heard from again. And this memoir that this girl writes goes on to become this huge New York Times bestseller. and it sweeps across the nation, and everybody is reading this memoir because everybody loves the morbid details of this abduction, and they want to see what happened to her, how she escaped. And it turns out that all the publicity she's getting for this memoir is a little unwanted, because it turns out that the girl who's still missing, her sister reads the memoir and realizes that everything written in the memoir isn't exactly true, and the story takes off from there. But the inspiration for the girl who was taken came from the kind of the pop culture of how we turn into celebrity missing people, and from Elizabeth Smart to Casey Dugard, I believe her name is.
Right.
And the girls who show up on People magazine, they were taken 5 years ago, 10 years ago. The three girls who were taken in Ohio and were held in captivity for 15 years, and miraculously came out of this guy's basement. And everyone wants to know, what happened to you? How did you get abducted? What happened to you during the abduction? How did you escape? And it's sort of these morbid details. And again, I'm part of society, but society wants these morbid details, but only in the idea that you're healing and you're healed and you're going through this metamorphosis back into society, and are you going to be able to adapt to society? And from all those true life stories, I came up with this idea of two girls disappeared from the same party and only one returns, and there's just a lot of dark secrets that have to do with the missing girl.
Speaking of that, you may remember a story a few years ago. There was a girl, Natalie Holloway, I think it was about 2005 or so, that went missing in Aruba. And and then there's this big, they found the murderer, they thought, and then he got away and all this stuff. Well, she was from my hometown, and her parents divorced, and her dad still lives where I do, and her mom lived over in the next state. But she, it was so weird when she was missing before they had solved it. People had yard signs with her picture, and pray for Natalie and all this kind of stuff. Like, these stories just really capture people's imagination. And when you started kind of getting into those stories and what it is that captivates people, what do you think you learned about people and why those kinds of things fascinate us?
Oh, that's a good question. It's maybe a psychologist would be better to answer it than I would. But what I'm fascinated with is, I feel like, and this comes up a lot in The Girl Who Was Taken, because this girl who returns and writes this book, she becomes this celebrity, and everyone wants to not only know the details, the morbid details about her ordeal, but it's centered around the idea that she's okay now. She's free now. She's healthy now. She's been transformed now, which obviously cannot happen. You always hope that anybody who's abducted, if they end up safely returning, you hope, you'd pray that they have a normal existence and that they are somehow able to get over that ordeal. But in reality, that has to stick with people forever. But in our sort of pop culture society, where we're going to turn these people into celebrities, that's sort of just assumed that they're going to be okay.
Right.
And you made it home safely. Now let's hear all the morbid details. And so that's what I sort of became fascinated with, and that's what this girl in the book struggles with, that everybody can't wait to hear the details, but they all just assume that now that she's free, she's okay, and that she has no secrets, and there's no issues with her having been gone for those 2 weeks, when in reality it's just the opposite.
Right. And a lot of times that sometimes probably living with those secrets and those scars and all that might be more difficult than if they would have died. I mean, that sounds morbid and but that's a heavy burden to carry. And, I would imagine that was, great fodder for novel writing.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, a novelist who's never gone through it, we don't know that.
Right.
That's what we're assuming, but that's why we write fiction. And we're not writing a true crime story.
Right.
We're writing fiction, but we can pull from these true crime stories to, add a sense of realism to the stories.
And by writing fiction, those of us that have not experienced that, get to kind of walk that tightrope of grief and fear and exhilaration and all of those things that we don't see in our comfortable, lives every day. And that's a powerful thing that fiction does for us.
Yeah, as a writer and the reader.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, as the writer, you're coming up with it, but you're going through a lot of the same things you hope your readers go through. And whether that be the dark side of an abduction or, the exhilaration of the other character and the girl who was taken is a medical examiner, and she's just out of medical school and she's still doing her fellowship. And so you get to feel all the joys and the challenges of that occupation when you write it. And if you feel it enough when you're writing it, then it should translate into the reader having the same feelings.
Exactly. That whole true crime thing that you mentioned a minute ago is really kind of white hot right now. We've got documentaries on Netflix, like what was it called? To Catch a Murderer? No, that's not it. Making a Murderer.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's on there, too. Making a Murderer, yeah.
Exactly. And then you've got a lot of podcasts, these true crime. NPR did a couple that just really, people just loved it, couldn't get enough of it, just super popular. And your new book, Don't Believe It, really digs deep into that. And I did... well, first off, where did the idea for this book come from? And I hate that question, where do you get ideas from? But when did you realize that these pieces of the story were going to come together?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, that's part of kind of figuring out a book, where the ideas came from.
Right.
Don't Believe It is my take on this true crime craze that's currently sweeping the world.
Right.
I mean, like you said, it started with Serial, the podcast. It continued with Making a Murderer. There's a whole investigation discovery channel that's all committed to true crime stories, and plus you have the perennial favorites of 48 Hours and Dateline that all kind of do these exposés on these true crimes of the did he or didn't he do it, and I just got obsessed with watching these, and if you listen to like Serial or S-Town or Dirty John, or you watch Making a Murderer, in this day and age, you don't just watch the show or listen to the podcast. You then go on the internet and you do your own research, and you go onto the website and you delve deeper into it, which is, I became obsessed with this in a good way. I mean, it was something I was really into it. And I started thinking when I got into these documentaries that having one of these documentary filmmakers as the protagonist in a thriller would be a great, great idea. Especially because if you watch enough of these documentaries, you realize that not many of them provide closure. At the end of the documentary, there tends to be more questions than there are answers, because, they're dealing with real life stuff. They can't just come up with stuff. But as the novelist, I'd be pulling the strings of the story, and I can create any ending and any twists and any surprises that I wanted. So I really thought it would be a great premise for a book. And again, I mean, I get excited thinking back about how I came up with the concept, and about when you're excited about the idea, you get excited about writing it, and it tends to translate into what I hope is a pretty exciting book.
Well, when I got the book, Charlie, and I opened it and I read the dust cover first, I said, "Oh my God, why did I not think of this? This is the best. This is the best premise I've seen this year. This is amazing." So, so you said that the documentarian would be a great protagonist for a book. So set up what is going on in this book, the documentary and the players in it.
So the story follows the filmmaker who's creating a true crime documentary about the murder of an American medical student that happens in the Caribbean, island of St. Lucia. The film centers around, like all these great true crime documentaries do, the film in the book centers around this mysterious woman who's accused of killing the medical student. The woman is what was the man's girlfriend, and she was also a medical student at the time that he was killed. And so she's mysterious and she's bizarre, and the murder is disturbing and haunting and grisly and all the things that sort of lure you into these podcasts and these documentaries. And our protagonist, who's creating the film, she looks into this case, and she just doesn't believe that this girl is capable of such a brutal crime. And so she sets out to find the truth and create a documentary to show what really happens. And the setting of the book is, I think, outstanding. It hops between New York, where the production company is, and it goes to St. Lucia, Sugar Beach Resort in St. Lucia, where the medical student was murdered 10 years earlier. And of course, the hunt for truth ends up taking our protagonist in a different direction than she ever thought she'd go with the documentary. And remember, this is a thriller, so it takes her into, very real danger, and it's just a fun read.
I want to take a pause from the show for just a moment to tell you about a sponsor. As a writer, your editor is often the first and last eyes on your work. The best editors are trusted collaborators, bringing your story to life in a way you didn't know was possible. Marlowe Moss will take your writing to a new level and your career to new heights, ensuring that readers not only buy your book, but also love reading it too. One top editor calls Marlowe Moss a talented author in his own right and as skilled an editor as I've seen. I use his skills myself. One of his authors says, "I had no idea my writing could be this good. Tension, POV, or timeline issues, plot, and pacing, Marlowe does it all, and for the price of a copy edit." Your hard work deserves a better editor, and Marlowe Moss is the editing partner you've been looking for at a price you can afford. Offering developmental and copy editing as well as beta and proofreaders, visit marlowemoss.net for more information and a free sample edit. That's MarloweMoss.net. And let me tell you, I have used Marlowe Moss. He has edited a story for me, and the comments that I got back were eye-opening. As a writer and as someone who spends time with words as much as I do, you tend to gloss over things. You just completely lose them because you're so involved in creating, and you need to step away and let someone else put their eyes on it and help you see the things that you can't see for yourself. Marlowe Moss is amazing. MarloweMoss.net. Excellent. How long did this book take for you to write?
So these are my yearly books. So this was about a 9-month turnaround. I think I started writing it in September of, what would it have been? September of whatever year it was, and then I turned it in July. So I remember turning it. We were going on a vacation. As a matter of fact, we're going on this vacation. My wife and I were going back to Sugar Beach Resort in St. Lucia for our anniversary. So my goal was to get most of this book done and be able to do the edits while I was in St. Lucia. So we went to St. Lucia for our anniversary July 19th. So I turned it in sometime end of June and got the edits back right before I was leaving for the trip. So I was able to do the edits while I was at the resort where the murder took place, which was great. But yeah, about 9 months.
Don't tell the folks at Sugar Beach that you wrote this book while you're there. They may not appreciate it. Oh man,
Sugar Beach is in a great light, though. It's just they just end up having a body wash up on the beach. That's all.
Right. As someone that writes suspense thrillers like you do, How much pre-planning goes into the book, or do you just discover the book as you write? Are you an outliner or a pantser or some hybrid in between?
Some hybrid in between. My contracts with my publisher requires me to write an outline, which I had never done for any book. So for all my failed manuscripts and for Summit Lake, I had never written an outline. But when I signed a contract, then I was required to write an outline. And I'll never forget, for the girl who was taken, I was in the process of writing the manuscript, and I thought, oh, crap, I gotta get an outline in like 2 weeks. It's due. And so I put together this outline. I turned it into my editor, and he said, okay, well, let's see what happens with this. And then when I turned in the manuscript, he said, I really, really love this manuscript. However, it has nothing to do with the outline that you submitted. There's no correlation. So outlining is really important. I end up being terrible at outlines. I don't have the brain to think of the concept from the beginning all the way to the end. I think I know the beginning and I know the ending. It's the middle that I don't ever really have mapped out very well. And so I think to get through that, you just got to write yourself through it. You got to write yourself out of blocks. You got to write yourself out of dead ends, and realize that a lot of what you're going to write in the middle gets thrown out. Because when you go back, you write the beginning, you write the ending, you write the middle. When you go back and read it, a lot of the middle is just you trying to get the words down to meet your deadline. And you get a much better sense of the story and where it's going on the second, third, and fourth time through the book. So for me, I have to write an outline, but I'm terrible at it. And in the end, I end up just figuring out where the characters tell me the story's going.
I don't care how many novels you write, the middle always stinks. Yeah, I call it the mushy middle. That usually
mushy middle.
Yeah, you're really excited about the beginning, and that first act usually just flies out. And most of the time, I have a really good idea of how the book's going to land at the end. Sometimes I even have the final scene already worked out. But man, that middle is a struggle some days.
Middle will kill you.
Yeah, well.
I've been writing where I wrote a couple pages, and I'm just thinking, I'm like, this is the worst I've ever done. I'm currently writing my fourth published novel, my seventh overall manuscript, and even earlier this week I wrote a page where I thought that was the worst page I've ever produced. And that page is in the middle, and no doubt that page is going to get thrown out. But you gotta write some inkling of that page.
Yep.
Will tell me what's going to go on a future page, and so it's important to write it. Yep. But it feels really good to throw the crap away.
Yeah, well, that's what I tell myself is, well, this page is going to be a fun one to edit because there's no way it's going to stand the way it is. But you're absolutely right. You've got to get it out. You've got to write through the bad words to find the good ones. And sometimes you have the right idea, the execution's just not there. But a few weeks later, when you come back and look at it again, you can say, well, I know what I was trying to do here, but here's a better way to do it. And if you just didn't write it at all, you probably would have lost that thread of thought or whatever. So yeah, the bad words are important too. Yeah. So Charlie, the book is out now. What do you think about after writing and trying to get published and kind of struggling through that and wondering if your words were ever going to find an audience, to then having 3 published novels that are doing great and that are really great books. What was your reaction when people started reading it and you started hearing from, quote unquote fans?
Yeah, my reaction then is still my reaction now. I mean, I'm still totally thrilled when someone wants to talk to me about my book, or someone wants to tell me how much they like the book. Like I said, someone tells me they don't want it to end, or they couldn't put it down, or they couldn't stop thinking about it. I'll never get sick of it. I don't care if I write 20 books. I would guess even my idol, John Grisham, would say, he's probably written 40 books. If someone came up to him on tour and said, your latest book was my favorite, he'd have to get a thrill out of it. And I don't see in my career that ever is going to go away. Someone telling me they loved one of my books, I'll always cherish it.
Absolutely. The new book is called Don't Believe It. Charlie Donlea, if people are just discovered you and your work for the first time, now where can they find you online? Or maybe they could find out more about you, dig into your back catalog, and follow you along the journey of the new book that you're working to finish.
So you can find me online at charliedonlea.com. My last name's spelled just like Chelsea. It's Donlea. I'm also on Facebook, Charlie Donlea Author, or Twitter at Charlie Donlea. And for anyone who's going to read Don't Believe It or is in the middle of reading it, or if you've already finished it, this weekend on my website, we'll be publishing all of the behind-the-scenes photos of when I went to Sugar Beach Resort in St. Lucia to do the research for Don't Believe It. So if you want to see some of the landmarks that are written about in the book, head to the website and you'll be able to see all those pictures.
I'm making a note right now. When are you going to publish that?
That'll be published on Friday. They're going to put it out on the website.
All right. Well, folks listening, this show is coming out on Friday. So when you hear this, look down in the show notes of this episode at hankgarner.com, and I'm going to have a link there where you can go see the behind-the-scenes photos to Don't Believe It. So we'll definitely do that. Charlie Donlea, it's been a lot of fun talking, and thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thanks, Hank. Great discussion.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Midnight struck. The Sandman had come. A few faint notes drifted through the rooms of 417 Gorybrook. The hollow wind testing the weatherproofing, the weak scritch of the persimmon tree against Zeph's window, and the drone of Hedwig's snoring. The old house shifted, creaked, and the shade of Agatha Van Brunt descended from the attic. "Brom?" she called. The ghost paused, collecting herself on the stair. She passed a mirror, but the glass remained empty, reflecting only absence. Agatha would not have recognized herself anyway. She had been beautiful long ago, and still was in her own mind. Not a toothless and wizened spectre. Not a blue chalk sketch of a hag half erased from the blackboard of night. She drifted into the master bedroom, disappeared into a shaft of moonbeams, and reappeared on the other side. She stood over Hedwig, listening to him snore. But Hedwig was not Brom. She needed Brom. She slipped through the floor into Zeph's bedroom. She stood over him for a long time, listening to the persimmon tree's weak coffin scratch on the window screen. Brom? No, this was not Brom. Not Brom, her son. But she loved this boy. So much hidden potential. He reminded her of Dylan, her grandson. Dylan had slept in this room. Many, many times. But Dylan was dead, never to return. This boy, Zeph, was alive. So alive. Oh, would that he might remain so forever. Look at him. Who would consign such a handsome lad to the rot of death? Only a very cruel and blind God. Agatha brushed her spectral lips to Zeph's cheek. He stirred, scratched the spot, and rolled into his pillow. But Zeph was not Brom. Where? Oh, Brom is dead. She remembered now. Brom is dead, and so are Hermanus, my husband, and Hans, my brother, and old Baltus Van Tassel, and Katrina, all dead. Only old Agatha remains, after a fashion, to trouble the world. Her sense of herself sharpened and returned to her. She searched the rooms for the Crane boy. She sensed him. Yes, here was the boy, sleeping fitfully, holding his animal. She extended a hand as if to reach into Jason's chest and take his heart in her talons. The dog woke, sensing Agatha's presence, and growled.
Growl till your voice cracks, cur. I could kill this child myself. I could possess the man or the boy. I could take the butcher knife from the drawer. I could stride through the night in strong male form and dissect this child at my whim.
Something struck her. Something blasted her up and away from the boy. She collected her energies again and tried to re-enter, but could not pass through the walls. When she found her voice, it came as hollow and cold as wind through a tomb.
Who is here?
Agatha whispered, and her tone might have withered grass.
Show yourself.
She waited with growing confusion and anxiety. She threw herself forward and battered the door like a tempest.
Who is here?
She cried. But no one answered.